Hello there and welcome to another edition of Ask David. This week I've been mainly weeding, coping with the results of the heavy rain and the wind, and just generally trying to support the garden and support the plants that are growing in it. But everything's growing like mad. As I said last week, the weeds are growing too like mad. But you've got plenty of questions that you've sent in, so I'm going to get on and answer some of them. So the first question this week comes from Sara. She's written in to say that she's got a 10-foot tall rose. It's growing against an 8-foot high fence. She said the rose is really old and woody, and she's only getting flowers at the top of the plant, and she's wondering whether she can be brutal and chop it right down to encourage it to flower lower down. So Sarah, I would be inclined, if you can bear it, to leave it until the autumn or next spring before you really cut that rose hard down. If I'm honest, I'd wait until next spring to do it. You could take out one or two of the main branches from low down on the plant to see whether that will encourage it to throw some new shoots. You could do that now, but I wouldn't cut the whole lot down in one go. So either be completely patient and wait till next spring, or take one or two branches out now and see whether that encourages new growth from the base. In any case, you've not got much really, have you, to lose. Now, another thing that a lot of you are writing in about is the sudden death of plants, whether it be the whole plant, the whole shrub, or whether it just be part of it. And we've got Barbara who's written in about her viburnum, and also Gemma who's written in about a peonies. And in both cases they've sent pictures in, and those pictures show the whole of those evergreen shrubs have gone brown in part, or the whole thing has gone brown. Both of them are asking what they can do about it and whether they can prune them now, and I'd be inclined to cut out all the old dead material, the stuff that's died, and investigate whether there's any living branches still. Gemma says that there are a few shoots coming from low down on her peonies, and I think that she could cut back to those new shoots, whereas Barbara doesn't really give any indication as to whether there are any living bits on the viburnum. But in both cases I'd be inclined to cut them back, cutting all that old dead stuff out and see what transpires. And then next spring you could do a little bit of remedial pruning just to tidy the plants up. Now, Rosie's got in touch with a question about liquid feeding her containers. She says when the compost in the containers is wet or during periods of heavy rainfall, should she avoid liquid feeding then because the nutrients can be washed through from the compost? Rosie, I'm with you on this. If it is a prolonged period of heavy rain, say over 2 or 3 days, then there's a chance that some of the nitrogen in that liquid fertiliser can be washed through the compost and washed away. You'll find that the potash and the phosphate are less soluble, so they should stay in the compost, but the nitrogen can be washed through. So I'd be inclined, as I say, to avoid periods of heavy prolonged rainfall, and also the other thing to say is make sure that your compost has got plenty of organic matter in it, because that will hold on to as many of the nutrients as possible, stop them being washed out of the compost, but still make them available to the plants. Now, Claire wants to know if I've got any tips for growing basil. She says she's been growing some in her conservatory and it's doing okay, seems to enjoy the conditions in there, but she says it doesn't really last very long. So Claire, the key things really are to make sure that you choose a good compost to start with that you're going to sow or grow your basil into, something that's moisture retentive and yet free draining. Make sure that you water your basil first thing in the morning, because the adage is that you should never put basil to bed with wet feet. So make sure that you water it first thing in the morning. And I also use tepid water that I've stood in a watering can or a bottle overnight to come up to room temperature, so there isn't a cold shock to the plants. And then the other thing to say about basil is it doesn't really like full sun at midday. So if you can make sure it gets plenty of light and some sunshine in the morning or in the afternoon, but not at midday, then your basil will thrive. And when you harvest it, just pinch the soft tips out to use, and then encourage new shoots to grow strongly from the base. And last for this week, we've had quite a few people get in touch about peony problems. Lucy says that her peony, one of the stems has just completely collapsed and died, whilst Neil has said that some of the buds on his peony have just wilted and died. So here it could be due to dry weather conditions followed by very wet conditions, and that alternating very dry a few months ago could have affected the peony, but ordinarily they should be able to cope with those extreme conditions. So I'm thinking it's more likely to be something called peony wilt. This is a fungal problem, and there's nothing really much that can be done about it other than to cut away the infected portions of the plant and either burn them or dispose of them somewhere away from your garden. Get rid of those diseased portions, the bits that have wilted, and then give a mulch around the base of the plant, keep the remaining part of the plant in really good health, and I would be inclined to give it a little bit of sulphate of potash or a high potash tomato feed just to toughen up the tissues and try and make it more resilient to the fungal attack. So there you go, a few more of the questions answered for this week. I'll be back next week, but in the meantime I've got plenty of gardening to be getting on with.